Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Christmas. I will now be entertaining you guys with some soothing sounds that bring mental clarity and help any kind of mental anguish. When the Galactic Civil War was just a few tiny isolated brush fires scattered across the galaxy, the disparity between the Empire and fledgling alliance to restore the Republic was glaring. For instance, the average rebel trooper had to pretty much bring everything, from their gear to all the supplies they needed to sustain themselves, even their morale. While in deployment, these troopers usually couldn't depend on supply lines because that usually attracted Imperial fleets, and so they had to stay small and nimble. They were constantly looking for misplaced Imperial weapons, any kind of extra fuel or food that they could find lying around. Some might call it foraging, others might call this activity looting or pillaging. The rebellion on the ground fought more like a warrior band than a conventional military force. There was no rotating from the front, no official training pipeline. It was a raw deal, especially if you take a look at who they were fighting against, one of the largest and most heavily equipped ground forces in galactic history. But that disparity only gets worse when you start comparing the Imperial Navy to the Rebel Navy. The Imperial Navy, for instance, was made up of the cream of the crop for the entire galaxy, which seems kind of odd because the Empire was organized by a mad Sith Lord, who relied on a rotating class of clowns, sycophants, sociopaths, and bureaucrats, and oftentimes criticized the policies of this administration as short-sighted, rooted in corruption, and just chaotic. But even I have to admit that their academy system was somewhat successful at finding the brightest and most intelligent people in the galaxy. Yes, this system was infused with Sith culture, and one could argue that actually talented people who weren't ruthless and willing to destroy their peers suffered in this kind of system, but the results were clear. The Empire managed to consolidate the entire galaxy's education system into one neat organization. Now, if you scored high on STEM subjects and had very good cognitive skills, most likely you weren't being sent to the infantry, you'd be sent to the Imperial Navy Academy. And depending on how you tested there, the best would go to secondary school for either piloting or to serve as a bridge crew on a capital ship. And from there, you further specialize for different roles and to pilot different platforms. It wasn't an Imperial lie or propaganda that their pilots were far better trained than the Rebel alliances. The perceived superiority of Rebel pilots can mainly be attributed to their superior starfighters and doctrine, not necessarily individual skill. You see, the Empire had a manpower problem after the Clone Wars ended, and it left most of the galaxy, especially the Outer Rim, in complete ruins. This meant you had a very high number of young adults that were unemployed, and historically speaking, whenever a society has a high number of young adults unemployed, that can lead to revolution, political unrest, a lot of crime. It's just not going to be stable. So whether you're a chancellor of the Republic or the Empire of an authoritarian militarized state, keeping people occupied is your number one priority. And Palpatine, well, he tried his best to occupy the masses with industrial projects and huge manufacturing buildups, while also significantly increasing the size of the Empire's bureaucratic and administrative infrastructure, all of which would be utilized by Imperial intelligence and surveillance networks to keep an eye on the populace, which was further enforced by the Imperial military. You could basically make the argument that by the end of the Empire's reign, half of the population was in jail and the other half was, being paid to guard them. Imperial pilots received a lot of training, not only to be competent in the cockpit, but also they were exposed to a lot of propaganda, a lot of indoctrination. This was to keep them loyal and to also make them keep an eye out on their comrades to make sure that no one was treasonous in a unit. The TIE fighters the Empire deployed were bare bones. They didn't have shields or hyperdrive, nor heavy weapons or life support. This meant that the pilots were completely dependent on their carrier ships for everything and lacked any true independence that would allow them to entertain the idea of rebelling. There's also the matter of cost. Palpatine had a bunch of people lying around that he could just feed into the meat grinders. I don't think he ever felt sad when he was looking at after-action casualty reports, but building ships is very expensive, and taking away resources from his own pet projects like the Death Star and his fleet of Super Star Destroyers to build TIE fighters is not ideal. The TIE fighter isn't necessarily a superb fighter platform as far as performance goes, but where it really did excel was its engineering and design. This ship was really just made for mass production and cheap cost. The twin ion engine that the ship was built around had 0 moving parts, making it one of the most reliable power plants found in any starfighter. Working on such a system also made it incredibly easy from a maintenance point of view. Mind you, this was the result of the consolidation of the entire starfighter industry in the galaxy that destroyed a lot of innovation and creativity. But yeah, Palpatine did some pretty extreme things to achieve extreme results, and the TIE fighter is definitely an extreme result. Now, the Rebel Starfighter Corps in the early days of the conflict was made up of a few different groups of people. You had Bail Organa's household Alderaanian Guard and Planet Defense Force fighters forming the core of the traditional Rebel Navy. You also had more ragtag groups in the peripherals like Saw Gerrera's Cavern Angels. Any new recruits that the rebellion received were mostly civilian pilots. They either, had their own freighters or were maybe the captains of luxury liners. Some of them also fought in planetary defense forces or corporate security. You also had a mix of bush pilots and swoop and pod racers. Basically, you had a lot of eager individuals who might all instinctively understand how to fly, but don't understand the first thing about fighting in a larger, cohesive military unit. Even Bail Organa's more professional security personnel were mostly trained to patrol and defend local space, not carry out the daring type of raids that the rebellion would against the Empire. But there was one thing that the rebellion did from a cultural point of view that the Empire never did, and I think this in many ways is why the rebellion would ultimately win. The rebellion cared about its pilots. Sure, it lacked the resources to really properly take care of them, and that led to some pretty hairy situations and a lot of heavy losses, but the High Command did take big steps to try to eliminate this issue. The rebel philosophy of putting people first can be seen in their choice as starfighters, whether it's the X-Wing, the Y-Wing, or even the A-Wing, and later on the B-Wing. All rebel starfighters are built for survival. They have shields, reinforced armor plating, and should they get separated from their units and carrier ships, they all had hyperdrives that could get them to safety. At the same time, rebel leadership was less hierarchical and more power was given to the squadron leaders, who often had the last say when it came to commands or just ignored commands from headquarters. They were all rebels after all, and what usually happened was you had a lot of loyalty and camaraderie in very tight-knit smaller units, and when these units suffered a casualty or you had a pilot go down, it was very common for the unit to drop everything and try to rescue that downed pilot. When Zeb Aurelius was stranded on the remote icy moon of Bahrain with ISB Agent Alexander Callas, his unit, the Spectres, came to his rescue and retrieved them. This made Callas realize that the rebellion was made up of people who cared for each other, a direct contrast to his own experience in the Imperial ranks, a military that again was ruled by a cutthroat Sith culture. When you have an organization with this type of culture, a lot of the actions taken by the organization are short-sighted and simply not sustainable. You have opportunists and sociopaths taking advantage of, weaker individuals in such systems, but normal people who are competent and have skills and leadership abilities to actually build a working organization are going to either get swallowed up in the chaos or they'll just simply reject the system and try to leave. And that's what we see for most of the Galactic Civil War, a slow but steady trickle of talented Imperial soldiers, pilots, commanders, leaving the Empire and joining the rebellion. And this really matters because, the rebels were losing a lot of people too. Between the Battle of Scarif and the Battle of Yavin, the rebellion loses both General Antok Merrick and Commander Garvin Dries. These two individuals served together in the Virjansi Rarefied Air Cav, a local planetary defense force that had been rolled into the Imperial Navy. The two PDF pilots had formed the backbone of the Rebel Alliance Starfighter Corps, and they were the ones who basically selected the X-Wing as a platform for the unit. They also came up with the idea of adopting mixed fighter squadrons that were far more balanced and more flexible at the squadron level to handle a wide range of mission types. It was actually a brilliant move and created a terrific foundation for the Rebel Starfighter Corps, which was really the only bright spot in the entire Rebel Alliance early on in the war. Luckily for the rebellion, when these two very experienced pilots were lost, you had new individuals stepping up in their place, and there was just about enough experience to keep the thing going. That's because they weren't just training bush pilots and freighter captains. The Rebel Starfighter Corps had real depth, and that was because waves of Imperial cadets were joining the ranks, including Big Starklighter, Wedge Antilles, Derek Cliven, followed by another wave after Alderaan was destroyed that pissed off a lot of Imperials, which included individuals like Thane Kyrell and, of course, Lyndon Javes. In the first few years of the Galactic Civil War, this influx of Imperial defectors was crucial for the Starfighter Corps' survival. Because the thing about dogfighting and space combat is once you've learned the basics on the simulator, that only gives you enough capabilities to not crash into your wingmates and do some, standard maneuvers. But the battlefield, it's actually constantly evolving landscape where both sides are constantly running drills and developing new tactics and strategies to win. And so you are always training like an elite athlete. You need to figure out new strategies and get ahead of your enemy at all times. When the TIE Interceptor exploded onto the scene, no amount of training can really prepare you for its capabilities. You need experienced pilots that have encountered these starfighters and have survived to spread their knowledge to the rest of the fleet on how to fight these things. For a small emerging force like the Rebel Alliance Starfighter Corps, This weakness in experience is one of their biggest limitations. Losing guys like Antok Merrick and Garvin Dries, losing most of Red and Yellow Squadron and Blue Squadron should have been the end for the rebellion. But the Empire, as usual, treated its own people with such disregard and callousness that no matter how many rebel units were destroyed, there were always enough professional pilots, a mix of rebel veterans and Imperial defectors, and of course Wedge Antilles, who refuses to die, to keep on fighting. I mean, heck, if you had more survivors at the Battle of Yavin, probably each one of those survivors would have started their own starfighter corps, and this is how flexible the rebel starfighter corps was. Everything was very decentralized, and the rebellion as a result had the same ability to grow and rapidly expand as a multi-level marketing scheme. What's even more surprising is the rebellion, despite lacking manpower at many crucial battles, kept a lot of their best pilots back and would put them in a training role where they could essentially teach the next generation of fighter pilots. Wedge Antilles spent half of the war training new pilots, usually after he was injured or shot down. The only reason he didn't make it to admiral was because of his personality. He just refused to be promoted out of a frontline unit. Once you do reach a certain level of command, it's a lot of bureaucracy and politics, which I'm sure he didn't want anything to do with. Others like Harrison Dula, who started out as a terrific combat pilot, were better suited for leadership. She would ultimately run a deep space training program for rebel fighters on an old Lucrehulk battleship from the Clone Wars era. Even Luke Skywalker spent a lot of time training new pilots and developing new tactics and strategies because this was a part of the rebel culture. There was a culture of cooperation and mutual learning, and that was a completely different type of culture from the more competitive and cutthroat vibes found in a TIE fighter unit. In hindsight, this was a brilliant move. It was brilliant for the Rebel Alliance to preserve these very capable individuals and try to spread that knowledge to your more normal rank-and-file pilots. But at the time, it was never an obvious choice, especially when the Rebel Alliance was so outmatched in those earlier years of the conflict that pulling your best fighters and saving them for other purposes seems counterintuitive. But this is something actually the United States learned pretty early on in World War II when it entered the war pretty late with a relatively inexperienced Air Force. We had a few pilots that might have served in Burma or in the Eagle squadrons in the UK or even in the Spanish Civil War, but we were outclassed. I mean, Imperial Japan probably had some of the best pilots in the world, and the Germans weren't that far behind, and they had been fighting wars in their own regions for many years now. First contact between American and Japanese pilots was pretty shocking. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies to Wake Island, American aviators found themselves being outflown by Japanese pilots in superior aircraft. It was quite demoralizing, but then they realized as more reports came in from the front lines that the Japanese planes weren't necessarily superior. Yes, they were able to outturn and outclimb American planes, but that was because they were lighter. Oftentimes they had unarmored fuselages, unsealed fuel tanks, and less powerful engines. It didn't really take much to destroy these planes. This is also why Japanese fighter planes were very nimble and usually had much longer range. Trying to outturn a typical Japanese fighter like a Mitsubishi Zero and a typical American fighter at the time, a Grumman Wildcat, was just a dumb idea. I mean, take a look at how stubby this thing is. Turns out though, this heavier and more robust American fighter was able to dive at much faster speeds, which led to a boom and zoom attack where American squadrons would try to locate Japanese units from afar and dive on them utilizing their speed advantage. All it took were a few shots to take down a Zero, and this strategy really changed how the war was being fought in the Pacific in the air. We also had pilots like Jimmy Thatch developing new fighter doctrine where Wildcat pilots would fight in pairs and cover each other during closer knife fights, which of course would really decrease the disadvantage of the Mitsubishi Zero's maneuverability. The Japanese had optimized the Zero to fight this type of long-range Pacific carrier war, but the United States was able to build their entire fighter doctrine to get around these advantages. They were never rigid in their approach to warfare, and they were constantly changing pilot tactics and also how their planes were designed and built. And as the United States industrial capabilities began to ramp up, soon their fighter platforms were outclassing the Japanese in every way. But the biggest difference between Japanese aviators and American aviators is how they treated veterans and aces. The Japanese Navy Air Services kept elite pilots at the front. Aces were celebrated, they were glorified by the culture. The Japanese legitimately had this warrior mentality, and unfortunately warrior cultures don't really win wars, they just win battles. In Japan's case, all their veterans were pretty much wiped out by 1943 and 44 because of continuous fighting. Their aviation training stayed pretty static, unless you count the creation of kamikaze units as an innovation. The United States, on the other hand, hand, managed to cycle back a lot of veterans and aces who finished their tours to become trainers back home. Many would train the next generation in waves of fighters, and this created a force multiplier that was extremely powerful and more than made up for America's late entry into the war. The Germans also suffered from a similar problem to the Japanese. Early on in the war, they did rotate veterans and aces off the front, but as Hitler started getting more crazy and delusional, as the German war effort started to grind to a halt, propaganda demanded heroes, and so the veteran pilots of the German Air Force were being thrown into the meat grinder as well. And so yeah, this is one of those things that isn't really talked about that much. We oftentimes focus on starships and individual pilot heroics instead of the systems and the mentality behind these organizations. That is extremely important. The Rebel Alliance Starfighter Corps was very much like a leech during the Galactic Civil War. The longer it hung around, the more talent and experience it took from the Empire. And even though the rebellion was almost destroyed on numerous occasions, the continuous influx of Imperial defectors to the rebellion is what ultimately sustained the growth of their Starfighter Corps. And thanks to the rebellion's more healthy culture, the High Command truly valued their elite fighters and put them into positions where they were protected and their skills could be passed on. Instead of just going into theatrics and drama, the rebellion from a very early stage focused on pragmatic choices to make a sustainable war effort. And that is why they ultimately won. They are the less chaotic institution. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time, and Merry Christmas.